Hey, what's going on, guys? Brian from Zombie Guitar here. This lesson is going to, again, look more into ways as to how you would go about inserting non-diatonic chords into a chord progression or a song, okay, in order to make your chord progression sound more interesting. Alright, so the last lesson was about borrowing chords from a parallel key, and I put a link in the description to that particular lesson if you want to check that out. This lesson is about secondary dominants. Okay, so secondary dominants are non-diatonic chords that you can use within a diatonic chord progression. Okay, so if you're in a key and all of the chords are in that particular key, you can use secondary dominants, which are not part of the key, but you can use it to spice up your chord progressions. Alright, so this lesson is basically going to show you how that works, and it's going to be divided into two parts. Number one, we're going to go over the theory of secondary dominants, and then number two, we're going to look at some musical examples about how you would actually apply this stuff. Alright, so with that being said, let's get started. Okay, so in any given key you have 7 diatonic chords. Alright, your 1, 4, and 5 chords are major triads. Your 2, 3, and 6 chords are minor triads. Your 7 chord is a diminished triad. Okay, so if you were to make all of those chords into 7th chords, your 1 and 4 chord would become major 7th chords. Your 2, 3, and 6 chords would become minor 7th chords. Your 7 chord would become a half diminished chord, and your 5 chord would be a dominant 7th chord. Okay, so your 5 chord in any given key is always going to be a dominant 7th chord. The 5 chord is always diatonic to the key. Okay, so that dominant 7 is diatonic to whatever key you happen to be playing in. Alright, now the function of a dominant 7th chord is that it wants to pull, or it has a feeling of tension that wants to be resolved to something. Okay, so the something that it wants to be resolved to is the 1 chord. Alright, so let's say I'm in the key of C major, for example. Alright, so I'm just going to play a little chord progression in the key of C major using the C chord, using the F major chord, using the A minor chord, and using the G dominant 7 chord. Okay, so you're going to hear that the G dominant 7 chord is going to want to pull to another chord. Alright, so let's hear how that sounds. Okay, so I did a little extended pause on the G7 chord there, but you see how the G7 chord, it didn't seem as the chord progression was finished yet. Okay, it didn't seem as if resolution has occurred. Reason being is because that dominant chord wanted to move to something, and that thing that it wanted to move to was the 1 chord. Okay, so the 5 chord always wants to pull to the 1 chord. Alright, the naturally occurring dominant 7th chord in any particular key, or whatever key you happen to be in, always wants to pull to the 1 chord of that particular key. Okay, so what are secondary dominant chords? Alright, so basically you know what the primary dominant chord is. The primary dominant chord is the 5 chord of whatever key you happen to be in. Okay, so to finish explaining this theory, we're going to stick within the key of C major. Taking a look at your circle of fifths, the circle of fifths groups the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 chords of any given key, like so. Okay, so if you're in the key of C major, here's your 6 diatonic chords. Okay, we won't worry about the 7 chord for now. We're just going to worry about the 1, 4, 5, and 2, 3, and 6 chords. Okay, so you know that the G7 chord would be your primary dominant that wants to move to the C chord. Okay, now you have 5 other chords that you could apply what is known as a secondary dominant to, that is going to want to pull to that particular chord. Okay, but those particular dominant chords are not going to be part of the key, but they're still going to work. Okay, it's still going to add interest to your chord progression, but it's not necessarily in the key. Okay, so let's see how that works. So let's take the F major chord, for example. Okay, let's say we wanted to apply a dominant chord to the F major chord. Alright, what is the 5th of F? Okay, what is the fifth of F? The fifth of F is C. You can verify that by either looking at the circle of fifths. Okay, so if you look at any letter on the circle of fifths, whatever letter happens to follow it in the clockwise direction is going to be the fifth of that particular note. Okay, so F, you look in the clockwise direction, you see a C. C is the fifth of F. You can also figure out what a fifth of a particular note is by looking at your fretboard and simply moving to the next higher string and then moving up 2 frets. Okay, so F is on the first fret of the low E string. Okay, C, okay, you go to the next higher string and then 2 frets up, there's your note C. That's the fifth of F. Okay, so C is the fifth of F. If you make that into a dominant 7th chord, you would have a C7. Okay, so C7 is now going to be this secondary dominant chord, and it's going to want to pull to the F chord. Okay, so C7. You hear how you play the 7th chord and it kind of has that feeling of tension and unresolved sound, and it wants to pull to something. Okay, so just as the G7, just as the G7 wanted to go to the C7, or I'm sorry, just as the G7 wanted to go to the C, a C7 okay, so C7 wants to pull to an F chord, okay? And then you have your G chord. So if you wanted to apply a secondary dominant to the G chord, okay, you would first determine what the fifth of the note G is. Okay, so the fifth of the note G, you can either look at your circle of fifths in the clockwise direction and figure out that that's D, or you can come and find your note G down here on the low E string, 3rd fret, go to the next higher string, and then up 2 frets to find your answer. Okay, D. Okay, so D is the fifth of G. Make that into a D7 chord. Your D7 chord is going to want to pull to the G chord. Okay, so D7. Alright, and you can do the same thing with minor chords as well. So you can apply secondary dominants to minor chords. Alright, the dominant chord that you're going to create is still going to be a dominant 7th chord, which is a major triad with that flat 7. Okay, so it doesn't matter if the chord that you're moving to is major or minor. The dominant chord is always going to be the same type of chord. Okay, so let's look at that. So A minor. Okay, so take your A minor chord. What's the fifth of the note A? You can find your A on the circle of fifths and then look right in the clockwise direction and see that E falls right next to it in the clockwise direction. Or you can find your note A right here, 5th fret of the low E string, go to your next string, and then up 2 frets and find that it's E. Okay, so E is the fifth of A. Make that into a 7th chord. The answer is E7. Okay, so E7 is going to be the secondary dominant of A minor. So an E7 will sound resolved after you play an A minor chord. So let's hear how that sounds. E7. Or you can play an E7 like this. Okay, so you can also apply these dominant chords to minor chords. Alright, you can do the same thing with the E minor chord and the D minor chord. Okay, so what's the fifth of E? The fifth of E is actually the open string, okay, and then you go to the next string up and then 2 frets higher, so the fifth of E would be B. Alright, so B7 wants to be, or is going to want to move to the E minor. Okay, so for the D minor as well. Okay, so the fifth of D, you can find your D on your circle of fifths, and then you go right in the clockwise direction and you determine that the fifth of D is A, so A7 is going to be the the secondary dominant for the D minor chord, okay? Okay, so these 5 additional dominant chords that we just came up with are secondary dominants. They're not part of the key of C major, but they will work. And in the next section, when we look at how to actually insert these things into a chord progression, you're going to see how this all works, and it's going to start making more sense. The notation for secondary dominants is basically, so if you're just looking at diatonic chords, you have your 1, which is notated by just a capital Roman numeral I, okay? Your 4 and 5 chords, notated by, Roman numerals 4 and 5 uppercase, okay? Then for your minor chords, your 2, 3, and 6 chords, they're denoted by, lowercase I for 2, lowercase I for 3, and lowercase vi for 6. That's your Roman numeral notation, okay? So your 5 chord is capital V, okay? Capital V is your 5 chord. So for your secondary dominants, you're still going to be using Roman numerals. However, it's going to be given in the form of slash chords, okay? So if you want to determine the secondary dominant of the F chord, okay? So F chord in this particular example is your 4 chord, all right? So what would be the secondary dominant to the 4 chord? It's going to be called the 5 of 4, okay? So V slash IV, okay, the 5 of 4. The 5 of 4 chord, the secondary dominant of the 4 chord in the key of C major is what? Okay, so we already determined that is C7. Okay, so C7 would be the 5 of 4 in this particular key. So anytime you see a slash like that, that indicates secondary dominance, okay? Or 5/7 of 4. You may see it written as V7 slash IV, okay? So if you wanted to determine the secondary dominant of the 5 chord, that would be written as V slash V, or V7 slash V, meaning that's the dominance, or the secondary dominant of the 5 chord. Okay, the 5 of 5, or the 5/7 of the 5 chord in this particular key. Just one more as an example. What's the secondary dominant of A minor? Okay, so A minor in the key that we're working in is the 6 chord. Okay, so what's your secondary dominant chord? This could also be said as what's the 5 of 6, or what's the 5/7 of 6, or what's the secondary dominant of the 6 chord, okay? We already determined that that was E7, okay? So E7 is the 5 of 6 in the key of C major. Alright, so that notation may be a little confusing, but when you see that written anywhere, that's what that means, okay? So the last part of this lesson is we're going to actually apply these secondary dominants to chord progressions, and you can see how it works. Okay, so applications of this stuff. So basically, you know how secondary dominants are determined, alright, and you know that secondary dominants want to move to another chord, so let's see how that sounds. So let's say we are writing a song or a chord progression in the key of C major, and the first chord is going to be a C major chord, and then the second chord is going to be an F major chord, okay? So our song is going to start out like this. It'll move elsewhere, okay? But let's say instead of just going from the C to the F, let's say we want to insert a secondary dominant right before the F, okay? So we're going to take a C, and then we're going to insert that secondary dominant of F, okay? Which will be the 5 of 4, okay? Because F is the 4 chord in the key of C major. So the 5 of 4 is going to be your secondary dominant, C7, okay? So let's hear how that sounds. Okay, so you see how there was a little bit more movement there. It didn't just go from the C to the F, it went from the C to the C7 to the F. So we just successfully inserted a non-diatonic chord into what would otherwise have been a diatonic chord movement, okay? Okay, so everything else sounded like it was in C major. Everything worked, but that C7 was just enough to kind of spice things up a little bit. All right, so let's try another one. Let's try, you know, maybe going from the C major to the G major to an A minor. Okay, so let's hear how that sounds. Okay, so let's say I want to insert a secondary dominant right before that A minor chord, okay? So A minor in the key of C is your 6th chord, so your secondary dominant is going to be the 5 of 6, or the 5/7 of 6, or the secondary dominant to the 6th chord, whatever you want to, however you want to refer to it as, okay? So what is our 5 of 6, or what is our secondary dominant? The answer is E7. E is the 5th of A. E7 is your secondary dominant chord of the A minor chord. Okay, so let's hear how that sounds. The first time around, I'm not going to insert the secondary dominant chord, and the second time around I will, just so you can hear how it all sounds. Okay, so it added a little bit of interest there, you know. It sounded like it was almost in key, but just enough to spice things up. All right, so you know, let's try it for. Let's move to the key of E major, for example. Okay, let's try some stuff in E major. All right, so you have your 6 diatonic chords in E major. All right. E, A, and B are your 1, 4, and 5 chords. C sharp minor, G sharp minor, and F sharp minor are your 2, 3, and 6 chords. All right, so you can write a diatonic chord progression that's strictly in the key of E major, and everything will sound great. But let's go ahead and insert some secondary dominants. Okay, so let's do a 1, 4, 5, 6 progression. Okay, so E major to A major to B major to C sharp minor, okay? Okay, so let's say right before the C sharp minor chord, I want to insert a secondary dominant. All right, so C sharp minor in the key of E major is the 6th chord. So I want to determine what the 5 of 6 is, okay, or what the 5/7 of 6 is. And what's your 5th of C sharp? Okay, so your C sharp is here on the 4th fret of the A string. You can move to the next higher string and then up 2 frets, and your answer is G sharp. Okay, so G sharp is your 5th of C sharp. Okay, so G sharp 7 chord, G sharp dominant chord is going to fall right before the C sharp minor chord. So let's hear how that sounds. Okay, so I kind of kept going with the chord progression, but you saw how I put that G dominant 7 chord in there right before the C sharp minor chord, and it sounded cool. It worked. It added just a little bit of interest that you may have been looking for. Okay, so this works for any of the chords. You can insert a secondary dominant chord before any diatonic chord, and it will always work. You can mess around with this stuff. You can insert as many secondary dominants as you would like. Okay, you could take a 4-chord progression and turn it into an 8-chord progression simply by putting a secondary dominant before each of the diatonic chords. Okay, there's going to be lots of movement going on. Listen to Beatles songs, listen to Billy Joel songs. They use secondary dominants all the time. Okay, lots of jazz. Secondary dominants are basically what jazz is all about. Okay, but it's a really cool concept, all right? Once you are aware of what they are and you're listening to a song and you happen to notice, okay, that chord doesn't quite sound like it's in key, but it sounds really cool and adds a lot of interest. More often than not, the reason being is because that particular chord is a secondary dominant chord, okay? So try it out in different keys, try using it to spice up your chord progressions, and you know, have fun with it. So any questions or comments, feel free to hit me up, and I'll be glad to help you out. Thanks for watching.